Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us on this bright sunshiny day, at least here in Salem. This is the 2020 pre-harvest sampling webinar. We want to talk to you about what is required of pre-harvest sampling and what paperwork you need to complete and hopefully accurately complete so that both the labs and our hemp testing specialist can make sure that we're matching everything up correctly. So with that, I am going to turn the time over to Emily Roach. She is our hemp testing specialist, and she's going to walk you through the PowerPoint. At the end, we will take questions via the question box and try and answer as much as we can today. Otherwise, we will follow up with you by email. And so with that, Emily, turning it over to you.
Oh, I wanted to first off say thank you to everybody who is watching right now or who will watch this in the future. I'm so excited to explain a little bit about pre-harvest hemp testing in Oregon. So I understand this is a fairly short presentation and I might not be able to get to everybody's questions. So please, if you have any questions or if you have a very specific situation that you need more guidance on, please feel free to reach me by phone or email. So let's get started. Move on to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to go over a bit of our agenda for today. First, I'll be explaining what a pre-harvest test is and who's required to get one and what goes into that. So I'll go over how to request a pre-harvest test, the type of paperwork you need to fill out. I'll go over the paperwork with you in detail. We'll go over hemp sampling and how that works and what you can expect in that regard. Then I'm going to talk about the steps you take once the sampling and testing is complete. So what happens when you fail a test? What happens when you pass a test? Lastly, I'll go over the record keeping requirements that we have for specifically for your test results. So, and then, like I said, we'll have time at the end for questions. So all growers are required to have each registered production area sampled and tested prior to the harvesting of that area. So two parts. All growers, it does not matter what your intent is of that hemp, if you're growing for seed or if you're...
Emily, we're having people tell us that they can't hear. And then others, Tristan says she can hear. Sorry to pause. Beth, can you hear? Okay.
Sorry, I can hear. It just took me a while to get to my unmute button. I can hear.
Okay. For those who can't hear, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. I will send a message in there. Maybe they'll need to log out and log back in. So apologize for the pause, Emily.
Yeah, and I have notes. Yeah, I have notes for this presentation. So if anybody wants those, or maybe we could do some type of closed captioning or something. So yes, as I was saying, every grower needs to get a pre-harvest test done. Does not matter if you're growing for seed, does not matter if you're growing for research, everybody's required to get a pre-harvest test done. Another thing is, as I've noted, I said production area. So I have a picture of the 2020 application or one of the versions of that. So if you remember, you filled out kind of a portion that said grow site information and then production area information. The grow site information was basically what I like to refer to as like your farm name or your production area or your site name, not really having any information tied to your growing areas there. If you go down to your production area, that's when you put whether it was field or a greenhouse or how many acres it was or what you were growing for. Those are the areas that we're expecting test reports for. So every area that you have registered, I'm going to be looking at whether or not we received any information for that area. Another thing is production areas must be contiguous. So if you received an email right after you submitted your application saying that your area was not contiguous and you need to separate those areas, you also need to keep them that way for testing. So an example of things that would make areas non-contiguous are if you're having multiple greenhouses back to back, each greenhouse needs to be tested and sampled separately, right? Because it's its own enclosed structure. It's not 5 greenhouses back to back are not contiguous. Similarly with hoop houses are generally not contiguous. And then like a county road. So if you owned both the property on this side of the road and the property on this side of the road, and you're growing hemp on both areas, but a road separates them, it's 2 hemp fields, it's not 1. Doesn't matter if you're still growing the same stuff and you planted the same date, it's 2 fields. Another thing is production areas cannot be combined for testing. So the production areas you listed here need to remain separate. You do have the ability, if you wanted to update your registration to combine areas, you could do that, but you need to do that prior to the sampling actually taking place, and it needs to be approved by a registration specialist prior to that happening. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is how you would request a pre-harvest test. You have to choose an ORLAP accredited and OLCC licensed laboratory. This list right here is available on our website. So you'd go on and you choose one of these labs. And I do want to note that make sure that the lab you're choosing is accredited to do what you need it to do. So for a pre-harvest test, the lab would need to be sampling accredited, and then also for THC potency. After you choose a lab, you would fill out a sample request form, which I'll get to in the next slide. And then you would submit that form. A lot of people do it by email to the laboratory that you choose and arrange a date for the sampler to come out. So this is the hemp sampling request form. If this is not your first rodeo, this form looks different. I wanted to make a form that kind of aligned more with our registration. So I'm just going to go over this from the top. So up here, it basically explains how to submit a hemp sampling request, and how to choose a lab and where to submit that to. And then it goes over the grower information. So you're going to put your grower name, and then if you registered under a business, that's where you would put your business name. If you did not register under a business, if you registered under your individual name, do not put a business name. Another thing is, if you have multiple businesses, you need to make sure that the business name that you're putting on this form is the business name that was registered for this area. So it's very handy to have a copy of your registration application with you while you're doing this, so that you know exactly what business name you put down for this area. Don't put a DBA name, put the name that is on your registration. And then also making sure that you provide both the phone number and an email, and then the registration number. I put IHG here because that's the only number that I really want. I do not want your handler number, the seed number. If you provide an HGS number, a site number, it's not the end of the world, but I really do prefer the IHG number. And then when we get into the hemp sampling area portion, we have your grow site name and production area name. And Sunny, if you could just click on the next button so I can pull up the transition. Yeah. So again, so if you have your application with you while you're filling this out, the grow site name is right at the top where you provide grow site name. That's what I'm asking for right there. And then your production area name is where you filled out number 8, and it says provide area name. That's the name that you're going to put for production area name. Okay, we can go back. Okay, so if you decided to break your production area up into different harvest lots, so if you had a very large production area and you knew you were only going to be able to harvest 30 acres at a time and you wanted to break that up, that's when you would choose to do the harvest lot name designation thing. You don't have to do this if you're not doing that. You would just simply provide the grow site name and the production area name. So if you were breaking it up, you have to put your production area name right where it says on that line, and then it's -2020-00, 2, 3, so on and so forth. So keep in mind that you need to submit a copy of this form for each harvest lot or production area that you're needing sampled. So if you're having 3 harvest lots from one production area, you need to submit 3 different of these forms for the sampler. Similarly, if you're having multiple production areas tested, you need a form for each one. So also provide your physical address, city, zip code, and then the total size of production area and size of area to be sampled. This is pretty important, especially when we talk about if you're breaking it up into a harvest lot. So if you're only sampling half of your total registered area, that's important for me to know. And then also, if we go down to area type, field, greenhouse, or indoor, there should only be one area type, because if you're having a field and a greenhouse tested at the same time and sampled as one, that's not contiguous, and that should not happen. So it should be either field or greenhouse. And if you're doing both, you'll have one that says field and one that says greenhouse. Intended use for hemp crop, please provide that. And then the declared start harvest date must be no longer than 28 days from sample date. So
Hey, Emily,
yeah,
we got a question about, could you clarify production area?
yeah, okay. So if you want to pull up that transition again for me.
Yep.
So if you filled out a 2020 application, it should have looked something like this. So your grow site name was the area that you just provided, basically the address of the site. There was no information tied to that in terms of acreage or anything like that. On the next page, right under that grow site information, you filled out a section called production area information. So this was where you checked whether or not it was a field or a greenhouse, and then the size of that production area, and then you checked the intended uses, and then you provided an area name and lat and long coordinates. So the production area are the actual areas that you're producing hemp on. So think of it that way. I hope that answered your question. If you need more clarification, please call me or email me. But essentially, it's the areas that you're actually registered that you're producing hemp on. For example, if you had a greenhouse, that would be a production area, or a field, that would be your production area, and then you put that information here. Okay, we could go back to the form. So after you fill out this portion, then you do a written description of the harvest lot. So basically, this is an area for you to provide in words a description about where your area is in regards to the property. So it's the sampler uses this, and I use this as well. You would say, for example, if your field was across from a barn, that's something you might want to include there. So being very detailed about the location, the size, that would be important here. And then in the visual depiction, that's where you would either provide a map of the area, or you would draw a map of the area, explaining, you know, what it looks like, maybe the shape or orientation of it, distinguishable features next to it. So if your harvest lot is along a road, you would want to include that kind of information. I also like to see the harvest lot circled and labeled, especially if it's next to other harvest lots, so I know exactly which area is being sampled and tested if it's with other areas that are not. So also being sure that you sign and date this is important too. Please don't just scribble a line for a signature. I think that's everything on the sampling request form. We can move back if people have questions about it still, but.
Well, and somebody had asked about production areas differing from harvest lots. So your field could be your harvest lot, your production area, or you could choose to break it up into multiple harvest lots. That's going to depend on the grower, right, Emily?
Yeah, so those two names kind of go interchangeably, because basically a production area is your harvest lot if you're harvesting it. But yeah, what I was referring to is if you wanted to break a production area into separate harvest lots, then you can use this naming tool to do that. But yeah, if you're harvesting a lot of hemp, then that's a harvest lot. So it gets kind of complicated.
And again, always, if you have questions, feel free to call Emily.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about what happens after you submit this form and you arrange a date for a sampler to come out. The sampler comes out and meets a site representative on the field. So make sure that there is a site representative there to meet the sampler, and then they'll go over the area with you. Each production area that you requested is sampled as required by rule. So the laboratory samplers have specific things that they're doing, one of which they're filling out an on-site sampling description form, which I'll look at along with your sampling request form to make sure it's the same area that's being tested and it looks the same. Sunny, if you wanted to click on the next transition. So this is also a table that the samplers use, and I wanted to show this to explain that the samplers have a certain amount of plant samples that they have to take per the estimated total number of plants. So please don't tell the sampler how many samples to take or which samples to take, because they're already doing their job. So if we want to go back to the slide. Once the sampler completes taking their sample, they'll take it back to the laboratory for analysis. And then typically the lab send our department the THC report along with the sampling documents that I just mentioned. I say typically because there are instances where this doesn't always happen. So I wanted to say that ultimately it is the grower's responsibility to ensure that we receive the test report and the sampling documents. So if you're unsure, please just always give us a call and I'd be happy to look it up for you. Okay, so after the sampler goes to your area and takes their sample, harvest must begin within 28 days from that date. So that's important. I heard that 15 days is going around there. It's not. This year we're doing 28 days, and that's from the date that the sampler was at your property taking the sample that you have to start your harvest. So if the results are equal to or less than 0.34% total THC, so 0.34 because we allow for some rounding of that 0.3 number, and then total THC this year. So last year we only required delta 9 to be measured for the THC potency test. This year it's total THC. So if it's equal to or less than 0.34% total THC, the grower can sell or transfer that raw hemp to another registered hemp handler for further processing. What the grower may not do is process that raw hemp in any way unless they were a registered handler as well. So you cannot trim your raw hemp into a product unless you're registered to do that. And then a grower may not sell the raw hemp to an unregistered person. So keep those things in mind when you're harvesting. Next slide, please. If the results are equal to or greater than 0.35% total THC, you do have some options. So you can have the file sample retested. You can have the production area resampled. If you are retesting or resampling, we need to be notified. And I will say that when we receive a failed test report, we reach out to you and kind of work with you through those options. So just keeping us in the loop is important with whatever your decision is. If you choose not to retest or resample, or if any of the retesting fails, the grower is required to destroy that associated harvest lot. And we must approve that destruction before it actually takes place. So that process is more involved than that, but in general, you need to be in contact with us and then we'll work with you through that destruction plan should you choose to do that. Okay, next slide. So if you wanted to resample your failed harvest lot, there are some requirements. So you must request that within 7 days that you receive the notice of the failed test result. And I wanted to talk a little bit about a harvest lot identifier here. So if you chose to break a harvest lot even more after you received a failed test result, you can do that. So remember, it goes production area, harvest lot. Let's say my harvest lot was Emily's Field -2020-001, and then I wanted to break that lot up even more for resampling after a failed test. I would just add an alphabetic character at the end of it. So it would be Emily's field -2020-001-A, and then B and C and D, however many lots that I chose to do. And sometimes people do this if they feel like there was a certain section of their field that maybe was testing way higher than the other plants and throwing the whole lot off. So you can divide up those lots and have them tested separately, and then harvest, obviously, the ones that pass. So resampling must happen within 10 days after the request for resampling was submitted. So making sure that you're working with a lab that can meet that deadline is important. And then also the original plants that were tested must still remain in the field or greenhouse. If the sample passes, the harvest lots can be sold or transferred. If the sample fails, you can get the file sample that the lab has retested, but you cannot have that area resampled again. So hopefully that makes sense. We can move forward to the retesting.
Well, Emily, could you clarify? So resampling must happen within 10 days after request is submitted. Is that request submitted to ODA and the lab? Who do they send that request to?
Right, so you would submit a resample request to a laboratory that you want to come out and resample your field. So we need to be notified of your decision. So I always suggest maybe if you're sending an email to a lab to come resample your field, CCing Hemp test reports on that email so that we're notified that you submitted that request on this day after you were notified.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So if you decided to retest the failed sample, you would have 7 days to send the same lab that did that test a request for a retest. If the file sample passed after a retest, then within 7 days you have within 7 days to request a secondary lab to confirm that passing result. So a lot of people don't know this. You have to be working with 2 different labs when you're doing a retest. So that requires the labs to coordinate in order to transport that file sample between each other. So keep that in mind when you're doing a retest. If it passes, then you're free to harvest that lot. If it fails, then that harvest lot must be destroyed by a manner that we approve. So I have a whole form talking about what your options are after you fail a pre-harvest test, and this is available on our website. So please feel free to take a look at this. It's always a good thing to have should you need it. So we can move forward to the next slide. So lastly, I wanted to go over some record keeping requirements, specifically a COA versus an ODA THC report. So a pre-harvest THC report is something that the labs fill out for a pre-harvest test. It is not the same thing as a COA. If you're unfamiliar, a COA, it's a report that the labs usually give out, and it has a lot of breakdown of like the CBDs and the THC. Typically, they have a picture on the top of them. That's not what we base our compliance testing off of. So we cannot accept a COA in lieu of a pre-harvest test report. So growers need to keep a copy of this report and all sampling documents for 3 years. So that's very important. And if you don't have copies of these forms, you could reach out to the labs or even us. If we have them, we'd be happy to provide that for you, but you definitely need to have copies of this for your records. The ODA THC report is a report that shows that a compliance test occurred and that the crop itself is legal. So this is important, especially when you're transporting. If I get a phone call from a different state or a different agency asking if this pre-harvest test was done and they send me a COA, I'm not going to be able to definitively say that a pre-harvest test was completed based off of the COA. So it's very important that when you are transporting, especially having that THC report, having both sampling documents with you. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Okay. So going back to the kind of harvest lots, production area. So multiple harvest lots make up a production area, multiple production areas make up a field. I think we still need a little bit more clarity around that.
Okay.
I'll take a stab and see if I'm getting it, because maybe I think of it a different way. So we've got our grow site, which is our property, and then each field on my grow site is going to be my production area, or each greenhouse. As long as they are contiguous, I can count that as a single production area. But under current rules, if I have two different varieties or strains growing in that field, I can choose to either have that field be one harvest lot, or I can say, I want those tested, each of those varieties tested as a separate harvest lot within that single production area. Is that an okay way to explain it, Emily?
Yeah, a lot of people do divide it up based on strains. So
Okay. So hopefully that helps clarify there. Another question, and this is a great one. Do we have to have a hemp handler's license to dry the flower?
no. So basically the least processing thing that you would need a handler's registration for is if you're trimming the hemp. But you can absolutely harvest your hemp, dry it. But if you're actually trimming that hemp and making it into something, you do need a handler's registration for that.
Right, but I could go ahead and separate the bud from the rest of the biomass and put it in one tote, and then put the rest of the biomass in another tote, as long as I'm not trimming that bud into pretty retail ready flour.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. I love this question. If you use a building for clones for the field and no longer have anything in that building, what do you do?
If you were using the greenhouse, so if it was like a greenhouse to propagate, is that the question?
Right, yeah, that's the way I'm reading it. So I started my plants here, but now I'm not going to be harvesting them there. What does ODA need to know about that?
Yeah. I always suggest when you're filling out your application, if you have an area for propagation, if you could include that information so that I know not to expect a test report from that area. Right now, what you could do if that didn't happen, you can absolutely just send us an email explaining that X, Y, and Z areas on my application are just for propagation. They're not going to have any test reports associated with them, and I'll be sure to make a note on your file about that.
Okay. Another question, when we get a pre-harvest THC report, do we also need to request our COA from the lab at the same time? I'm going to tackle this one. So a COA, or certificate of analysis, is really an industry-driven document. So you may have somebody who is planning to purchase your plant material from you and ask for a COA. That's between you and the lab and whoever you're selling your product to. ODA needs those other documents that Emily was talking about. Excuse me. So it's up to you when you request the COA, but that's not something that ODA would require. Okay. Earlier, you said a farmer has 28 days to start harvest after they pass the pre-harvest test. Is it 28 days to finish as well, or just start harvest?
Nope, it's just to start your harvest. So as long as you're actively harvesting your area within 28 days from that date that the sampler came out, that's fine.
Okay. And harvesting in earnest, you can't just like harvest one plant this week and then be like, I'm working on harvest, and then next week harvest one plant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So we'll be providing links to these documents and a copy of our slides. Providing everything goes kosher today, we will have a webinar, a video of this linked on our website. Also, somebody asked earlier about an example of these forms filled out. We can work with Emily to get an example of that put on our website, so absolutely. And if you're specifically wanting a PDF of this, I think everybody has my email address, so either Emily or I can send that information to you. Do I need a hemp handler's license to sell?
No, as long as you're registered as if you have your grower's registration and you're referring to selling your raw hemp, then you would just need your grower's registration. You don't need a handler's registration to sell.
As long as you're selling to another registrant in Oregon. So you would need that handler's if you were, again, trimming the flower into, say, ready to use hemp, because then it's now a retail product and you've changed it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Biomass versus flower, what if both? I'm not sure what you're asking there, Robert, so if you want to give me a little more clarification, that would be helpful. Oh, how does this impact sampling? I'm assuming that's in regards to your biomass versus flower. It doesn't matter what you're growing for in Oregon, you are required to do this sampling, and it's the same. Yeah. If you're growing for seed, do you need to do a pre-harvest test?
Yes. Yeah. That is, a lot of people don't think that you would, but our rules don't have any exceptions for people growing for seed or research purposes. So you still need to abide by that and get that pre-harvest test done.
And I would also remind people that you would need to have the ag hemp seed registration if you're going to be selling it to anybody else. If it's seed that you're going to use for yourself for next year, or if it's grain, you would not need that. But if you're planning on selling those seeds to somebody else, you would need both. And honestly, other states and the people that you're selling to are going to want to see that pre-harvest test anyway. So you absolutely need to do that. So Kara asked what the website is. This oda.direct/hemp takes you to the ODA website. That's where we'll be linking these documents and this webinar. This oda.fyi/subscribe gets you to a page where you can sign up for our email listserv. We have one specific for hemp. There may be other ODA ones that are useful for you as well. And then the oda.direct/cannabis is our general, for us, cannabis means hemp and marijuana, general page. And we have links to the other programs like food safety, ag water quality, weights and measures, and pesticides, and where they come into play for all things cannabis. So another question for you, Emily. I read that farmers should harvest early this year due to total THC. Is this true?
Yeah, I can't really speak. I can't give any advice about when you should harvest. But I will say that we did switch our requirement last year, obviously, was Delta 9. This year's total THC. So you might want to think about that if that's where you think that you're going to be at. I can't really speak to that, unfortunately. So
yeah, it's definitely going to depend on your varieties, and the longer you leave the plant in the field, the more that THC concentration is going to go up. And I know when you're getting paid and looking for those high CBD concentrations, it's a little bit difficult to know exactly when you're going to need to harvest. Next question, does the handler license include making extractions like a CO2 extraction?
Yeah, so any type of when you're taking raw hemp and you're turning it into something, you need a handler's registration for that, basically. So.
Yep. Oh, so when somebody is growing for both flower and biomass, do you want them to check both boxes?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. What are approved methods of destruction?
So basically the way we currently address a failed harvest lot or someone who wants to not do any retesting or resampling is we will get in touch with you and send you a destruction plan. And so that's something that you fill out, and actually you're the person who explains what's going to be best for you in terms of destroying that hemp. So typically it's already an approved method. We just have to get some signatures on our end, and we say, okay, you're good to go. A lot of people suggest burning it or composting it. Basically anything that renders the hemp unusable will be acceptable.
Yeah, tilling it under, and making sure that we're documenting it either via photographs or our staff being on site. Okay, is it too late to obtain a handler license for 2020?
Nope.
Those are calendar year licenses, and we'll pretty much continue to accept them through about November. Much later than that, and it's not going to do you any good anyway, right?
Yeah.
I'll take this question. What does the Hemphandler Reciprocity registration do for an individual? So there are folks who are interested in transferring raw hemp into the recreational marijuana program that's regulated by the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, also known as OLCC. And the state law says if you're taking raw hemp and turning it into something else, you have to be registered as a handler. So we reduce that registration fee for those who are already licensed by the OLCC, but are also required to have a hemp handler registration. And we call that our handler by reciprocity, because ultimately OLCC is going to have more enforcement and more stringent requirements on that processor than ODA would, but they're still required to have a handler. What is the lead time to apply for a handler license?
I would say, so it usually takes about 4 weeks to process a handler's registration, but I will say that if you do not currently have a land use compatibility statement, that's a requirement for the handler's registration, and that might take some time to get. And so you'd go to your county or local planning office to get one of those. So that needs to accompany your handler's registration.
Absolutely. If we run fresh hemp through a debucker and trimmer prior to putting it into a dryer, do you need a handler's license? Would sell final bulk material in raw form?
I would say no. If it's part of your harvesting process, that's fine. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, I would agree. As long as it's not like trimmed to go through to retail. Again, if it's a retail ready product, you really need to have that handler, and then there's more stringent testing requirements. Next question, do you have a list of testing labs to get testing done?
Yeah, so that was, we showed that on a slide earlier. And the list is on our website always. And so it's under that testing and laboratory section. I'm gonna pull it up. So this one right here. And this shows you all of the labs that are accredited to do this type of testing. So you would choose from one of these. And as I mentioned, there are a couple who are not approved to do sampling. So make sure that whichever lab you're choosing is approved to do that. So yeah, that's available online.
Okay, the lab sampler will send the results directly to ODA. Do I need to be copied as well?
I always suggest that, just so one, you ensure that you get a copy of your THC test report and the sampling documents, and two, so that you know that it was sent. A lot of times, certain attachments don't get included in emails, or emails don't get sent. So like I said, it's ultimately up to the growers to ensure that we receive everything we need to. So I would suggest being copied on the email, but it's not a necessity.
Yeah. If you have two separate harvest times in one growing area, like succession harvesting, can you split those into multiple pre-harvest compliance tests?
Yeah, so that's kind of like what I was talking about with the harvest lots. So if you know this section's going to grow faster than the other section and it's going to need to be harvested before, that's when you would take that production area, the overall production area that you had registered, and say, you know, this half of it's going to be a harvest lot and this half of it's going to be a harvest lot. And so you would submit a pre-harvest sampling request form for that one section of that field that's going to grow faster, and then later on submit a second one for the other one. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Can a farmer R&D, so research and development, prior to pre-harvest tests? So I think what Robert's asking here is, can I kind of have tests done through the growing season that are not compliance tests to see where the crop is?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us about the results you saw? Did any of last year's results pass the total THC percentage?
So last year we did not require a pre-harvest test to be for total THC, and so all the results we got were for Delta 9. Yeah, I'm sure some would have passed the total THC if they were measured under that way, but I don't have that data with me, so.
Yeah, okay. I think we kind of talked about this, but happy to always talk about it again because it's super confusing. Can you clarify, under the grower's registration, you can cut the flower, but for other trimming, you need a handler's registration, correct?
Yeah, so anytime you're sitting down trying to trim the hemp to make it into a product to sell it, that's going to require a handler's registration. Really, it comes, if you think about it, that product requires more testing. So the only thing a pre-harvest test report or a pre-harvest test tests for is THC potency, because it's not an end-use product. So then in a handler's registration, you're required to get additional testing to make sure that it's safe for the consumer. So anytime it's going to go straight to consumer, you're going to need to get more testing done. So you're not able to do that under your grower's registration.
Thank you. Do we need separate forms for each harvest area to be tested or harvested?
Yes, so if you're having multiple harvest lots, then you're going to want to fill out one of those forms for each harvest lot. And so it says it at the top, complete one copy of this form for each harvest lot or production area. So, you know, making sure that if let's say you have 10 greenhouses registered to you, we need one form for each greenhouse because that greenhouse is going to be sampled separately. And I will say that whatever you list as your production area name absolutely needs to match what's on your registration. So it's really helpful to have what you filled out. And I know that there's some time lag between the two, but when you filled out that registration application, have a copy of it with you so you'll know exactly what you put, what the GPS coordinates were that you put. And so that name needs to match the production area name. So don't put anything like your strain name or the date you planted, because I'm not going to have that information. All I'm trying to make sure is that the areas registered are the areas that were tested.
And I would add, a big reason for this, whether you like it or not, is you want us to be able to tell local law enforcement when they ask, is this a legal field? Yes, and we can show you registered it, you had it tested. So we need all of that paperwork to match.
Yeah.
So a comment, we thought the total THC levels had been changed to 1%. I'll address this. That is definitely something that the industry would like to see, but that is going to require a change at the federal level. Congress will need to change that. It is still set at 0.3. In the 2018 Farm Bill, it defines hemp as cannabis that has 0.3% THC or less, and it requires that states do the testing post-decarboxylation. So that includes the potential for THCA to be converted to Delta 9, and that's where we get that term total THC. So I know we would all love to see it move to 1%, but that is definitely something to talk to your congressional members about. Okay. Is The ODA is supporting, facilitating market demand or any infrastructure for the marketing of hemp, similar to supporting corn or other crops. Our ag marketing program is starting to work with hemp. We're trying to figure out where our role is. Oregon State University has started the Global Hemp Innovation Center, and their extension staff are starting to work with hemp. So we're government, things move slowly, but yes, we are looking at those opportunities and trying to determine how we can help facilitate that. We helped somebody who was sending some CBD isolate to Brazil recently. So we're definitely in communication with other ag marketing partners like US Department of Ag, Business Oregon, et cetera, to see where those opportunities are. How much are handlers license?
$1,300, I believe.
Yeah, and again, that requires that land use compatibility statement, which I think has been the biggest stumbling block for some folks, is making sure that they have that completed by their local planning department. Do we need to test the finished product after creating a product as a handler?
Yes. So we might be, if there's interest, it would be, it's possible to do another presentation on post-harvest testing, but depending on what that product was, there are certain testing requirements that you're required to do that are a little bit more involved than a pre-harvest potency test. So if you have specific questions about that, reach out to me and I'll walk you through that.
Absolutely. The Lux, I was told last year it was only applicable for a processing license. Please clarify for handlers and processing or just processing, for example, converting hemp to oil.
Right, so this year, the handler registration is the only registration that needs to be accompanied by a Lux. And so within that handler's registration, you're allowed to process. So it doesn't matter what you're processing, you need a Lux to do any of it. So,
right, trimming into retail ready flour is included in that processing.
yes.
Due to COVID, can pre-harvest testing be sent into a lab rather than tester coming onto the property?
No, and that's something that I wanted to also touch on. You cannot take your own samples and send it to a lab for a pre-harvest test. That's not a pre-harvest compliance test. So similarly, this year, I understand COVID is throwing a wrench on a lot of people's plans, but I would recommend reaching out to the labs and seeing what I know a lot of different labs are taking really intense safety precautions, so maybe communicate with them and express your concerns and try to work something out. But absolutely, a sampler needs to go to your hemp field and sample it.
Do we have to use a lab in Oregon for the ODA test?
For the pre-harvest test, yeah. So the labs that are approved to do a pre-harvest test are Oregon ORLAP accredited and Oregon Liquor Control Commission licensed. So all of those labs, I believe, are in Oregon. They might have different subsets in other states, but you have to use one of those labs. So
yeah, absolutely. So we're just going to answer a few more questions. Again, if we don't get to all the questions, we can follow up with you. If I had an oil made by a handler, am I allowed to formulate products and sell them without a handler's license?
Yeah, so a handler's license is for anybody who takes raw hemp and then turns it into something. So if you're not taking that raw hemp and making a product, you don't need a handler's registration to do that. But I believe, making sure that that final product is going to pass the 0.3 total THC requirement is something that you should always be doing before you sell it to a consumer.
It's actually required. So once you start harvest, there's no deadline as to when it has to be finished?
So you have 28 days from the date that the sampler was at your property to start your harvest in earnest. So keyword is in earnest. So if it's been months and you still haven't harvested all of that crop, then that's not in earnest.
Yeah. Question about, did we increase the cost of a handler's license this year? We did not. If we don't have a buyer, but our crop is dried and not trimmed, how long can we hold it?
Yeah, so there is no date that you have to get rid of the hemp. And I actually get a lot of questions about hemp that was grown in 2019 that you still have this year. So if you grew hemp in 2019 and you passed pre-harvest in 2019, which was 0.3% delta 9 THC, if you pass that, you're still allowed to sell that this year, even though the rule changed. The rule was anything sampled on or after January 1st has to be for total THC. So if you got your crop tested in accordance with our rules in 2019, that's still a legal thing to sell. And we don't have any requirements on when you have to sell any harvested hemp by.
The only requirement would be that you would have to be registered as a grower this year, which is part of the reason why we split the grower registration into a fee just for the grower and then a separate fee for your production areas or grow sites, is so that for those who have hemp from last year who maybe don't want to grow this year, you have to have a registration in order to legally sell or transfer that you grew last year. Okay. In our presentation, it says total THC greater than 0.34. Please clarify, is it 0.3 or 0.34?
Right. So we do allow for rounding. So technically the rule is 0.3%, but if you have a pre-harvest test tested at 0.34 or below, we round that down to 0.3. But if you're at 0.35 or above, that's above 0.3. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So kind of just skimming through here. Again, the forms are available on ODA's website. The list of labs are available on ODA's website. And let's get back to that last page. So you can go to this oda.direct/hemp. You can email this email address, and that goes to both Emily and I. There is no seed to sale tracking in the hemp program. That is only for the adult marijuana program. This presentation will be available in a couple of days on our website. And then the final question, if I didn't grow last year, can I resell 2019 legal hemp if I have a 2020 grow license?
Yeah, so yeah, as long as you know the hemp was tested and then passed pre-harvest testing when it was before it was harvested, that's fine. Just making sure you're registered and then you're selling to another registrant.
And buying from somebody who's registered as well. Okay, for those questions that I wasn't able to get to, I will follow up, or Emily will follow up with you directly via email. And we really appreciate everybody taking the time today to listen to the presentation and ask the questions. The better you are at doing your pre-harvest testing and filling out this paperwork, the better Oregon's hemp industry is going to be. And I think we're all very proud of the industry that we have in Oregon, and we want it to continue to be one of the leaders in the country. And a lot of people are looking to Oregon to see how we do this. So you taking the time to make sure that you understand the process is extremely important in that. And please go enjoy your day, drink lots of water, and we will talk to you again soon. We will be using this tool more throughout the year, I think, as we learn how to use it and find that it's a great way for us to interact with you. With that, we will tell you goodbye.